Identify and book the world's best speakers for your next event. MENA Speakers is the leading speakers and MC bureau in the Middle East. We bring global talent to the region and have established the region as a key global hub for speakers. Inspire and motivate your audience. Find exactly what you are looking for by working closely with us to assist you in understanding the cost-benefit analysis tied to selecting a speaker for any event. Ensure that your audience is educated, engaged, and empowered. Connect with us for a quick response and tailored advice. Book your speakers now.
Get those managers developed throughout your organization, having them understand exactly what engagement is about, the role they play in the whole engagement scheme. It's not just the organization that comes back and our scores were very low. Well, that comes back down to every manager. Good morning, good afternoon, depending upon what part of the world you're in. If it's Friday, it is the CEO series. Our guest today is Stacey Harris, who is a past guest, is a Chief Research Officer, Managing Partner at Sapient Insights Group, where she oversees industry research work, including the esteemed annual HR System Survey and White Paper. She sits on numerous boards. She's listed as one of the top 100 HR influencers from HR Magazine. Stacey, good to see you again.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see you again. It's great to get a chance to reconnect, and it's perfect timing because we just launched the big annual research in October, November of this year. So we're wrapping up the year with some great data. So
okay, good. So let's talk. I want to talk about the book. The book was released.
Yeah.
So tell us about the book. Introduction to HR Technology: Understanding to Improve.
Yeah, so the book is actually is a culmination of the research that I've been doing for the last 20 years in this space, right?
Okay.
You know, I started out as a practitioner, moved into leadership HR roles, and then started doing research at some firms, organizations might know, like Burson and Associates and Brandon Hall. So I've been doing it for a long, long time. And I realized that as I was releasing each of my own sort of big papers every year, there was a lot of history that people needed to catch up on to understand the data, right? It's like anything else. Data is only valuable if you understand the context.
Yeah.
And HR and people analytics is only sort of really valuable if you understand the history of that. And so the book was my effort to sort of say, what did I need to know when I started in this industry? Okay. And then what would be of value to anybody, executive, CEO, chief financial officer, chief technology officer, who was trying to understand why the HR technology and the data they were getting out of their people analytics was showing up the way it was, right?
Okay. Okay.
And so it was really that was the essence of the book. And Kogan Page Publishing is my publisher. Okay. They're out of the UK, and they were very kind enough to work with me through the middle of the COVID crisis to get it finished. So,
okay. So you mentioned the so-called C-suite,
yeah,
and them understanding that, you know, the technology side, the data side, the people side. There's so much talk now around analytics. What would you advise a practitioner how to get a leg up, so to speak, on understanding data and analytics, or the importance of this so-called evidence-based approach?
So the first thing I think any practitioner, any executive needs to understand when they walk into an organization is where their data comes from. You can't understand your data unless you understand where it comes from. So, okay. and it's really practical stuff to some extent, right? You know, I think everyone thinks they understand what a full-time employee is, right? You and I have had this conversation, but there's actually a lot of definitions for a full-time employee. So you might have come from one organization where an FTE meant everybody in the organization plus you come to another organization and an FTE is just those people who are working 30 plus hours, right?
Okay.
So there is a conversation that I think you first have to have, which is understanding where is the base level data that you're getting coming from? What's the starting point for all that information? What systems is it going into? Who's maintaining it? Who's overseeing it? And then I think you can start asking questions about what you want to do with the data. If you jump right start making decisions about the data, even if you've been an executive in 10 other companies where you think, I get this, I should know this off the top of my head, I think this is where mistakes get made, right?
So the context, because the DNA of the organization could be different from the place you came from.
Exactly. Very much so. It's not just a cultural issue. It is a technology maturity issue. It's an issue with how well they've maintained and cleaned their data. It's an issue with how many different, takes on the data is, right? So you might be making one decision and someone else is making a different decision. They're seeing the same data because they both look at it from different directions, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of have to get that understanding before you dive into because all data is, it gives you options. It does not give you the answer. And that's, I think, the biggest thing most business leaders have to understand. Unlike a lot of the historical work that we've done, and you've and I have talked about this, is historically technology would give us an answer because a human being had already made that judgment call on the data, right? They'd said, if it says this, it's a yes. If it says this, it's a no. Now the technology is making some of those judgment calls, and you as the end person have to make, you're like, this is data now. I've got to filter in my own judgment here, right?
So, I think that's is that kind of an AI approach and, making assumptions, data pulls it down, and based on certain algorithms, this is a possible solution. So how does an HR person that's overseeing that, because everybody talks about, oh yeah, we have a dashboard, but my thought is, so what? You have Excel spreadsheets. So what? What are you doing with that? And can we explain a business case of a challenge we have and have that dashboard provide us with a starting point to do what we need to do? So what I'm summing up to say, it's not an end all be all just because you've got a dashboard.
Yes, exactly. It really isn't. It is a starting point, and it depends a little bit on how well the person who put the dashboard together understood your company and your data and what story they're telling with it, right?
So for someone to conduct that so-called audit and look across, even something as simple as you mentioned, the FTEs and the way we define that, would you suggest that maybe we create kind of a glossary of what terms mean? Because if I come from someplace else, it means something else. And if I've got 10 different interpretations of that, God forbid, how that solution is going to be arrived at.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. I know that sounds almost like, oh, it sounds so ridiculous. Especially if
elementary, right?
Yes. Especially if you come from something like finance, right? So, and I always remind people, finance had 100 years almost now of defining what, revenue actually means in an organization, right? When revenue wasn't a standard term, in 100 years ago, we have not had that same type of history in the HR space, and we're getting there. I think that as governments start to require certain metrics, we will get more clarity. But I do think that yes, you do have to almost get as simplistic as what are the definitions of all the key major metrics that we're measuring, right? And you also have to get very aware of the technology too. You have to know your system, whether there's a big difference as to whether you have an on-premise PeopleSoft or whether you have a newer version of a cloud solution like a Workday and Oracle HCM, right? Or whether or not you're using maybe a conglomerate of different applications like ADP, Ceridian, like there are
siloed systems.
And that will make a difference in the data you're seeing too, right? So I tell people you need to do an audit. You need to do an audit of your primary definitions of the key metrics in your organization. You need to do an audit of all of your technology, and you need to make sure there's a clearly defined, updated, updated area where all of that information is sort of kept and maintained. because, and surprisingly enough, that's why a lot of people take my survey every year, is it gives them a way to do that. So,
Okay. Yeah. Give them some insight, as it relates to that. So for someone that's sitting in the space, would you suggest an analytics course to try and understand that? How could let's go back to your book. Would your book give me insights of the steps I needed to take and understand something as simple as a glossary kind of approach?
It would. So the way the book is mapped out, because I'm a person that likes to break everything down into the smallest common sort of piece of bit. I'm a learner, a block learner, right? I put pieces into categories and then build those categories out. And what I really did in this book is I basically broke down 12 chapters of basically saying, what is the technology? What is the technology tracks? That's your definitions, right? Who owns it? Who maintains it? There's two different conversations there, right? Like who uses it, who maintains it, and who owns it. And then I walked through each major category of the technology and talked about the type of data that was in it, the historical perspective, where that category came from. And then at the end of every chapter, I put in, why does it matter to you if you are an HR professional? Because there's a component of that. And then every chapter has an exercise, which is basically a series of exercises that you as a professional should do to go within your organization and identify the data you need to basically write that same kind of chapter for your company, right? Like, because I think I walked through this. What would I need to know about my company systems if I were making the decisions that I see organizations making every day? That's a lot of what it is.
So here's the dilemma that I see inside of organizations as it relates to what you're talking about. I may not have the skill set and capability in that HR team to do that kind of an audit. Yeah. What kind of assistance, or how could we approach that from basic knowledge to understanding the so-called big picture?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I think, there is a big push in the market. And I think the last 2 years have definitely elevated the conversation that every HR professional should understand HR technology. It is not just the HR IT professional or the head of shared services or your head of operations in IT, right? Who should understand the technology conversation. It really, just as if you were in marketing, there isn't a marketing professional out there who wouldn't understand what their system is for distributing information to their customers, right?
Okay.
And so I think that if they don't have the skills, that's part of our role, which is to figure out how do we develop those skills. And I think you develop them with hands-on work. They've got to get in and understand it. Yeah. They've got to know where that data comes from. And that makes that technology that holds it more interesting.
Because you hear these stories, everything is siloed, multiple systems, not talking to each other. And I remember reading about one consulting firm. Their approach was not to sell you something new, but to bring their team in and connect all 5 of those various pieces of data sets into one kind of dashboard. And I said that was a pretty cool idea, as opposed to you going out and spending X amount to do one system. And you could probably understand the cost structure behind that, as opposed to someone coming in and connecting them together. Would you advise that kind of approach, or?
I think there are different approaches to figuring out how to better way of getting the big picture, right? There are some organizations, Dell's got a great case study of having over 40 plus, HR people-based systems and ripping them all out and replacing them with 4 or 5 really big ones, right?
Wow.
And I think, we've seen very large organizations undertake those massive types of transformations. And I think, in their own ways, they have positives and they have negatives. I think, there's a lot of people who would say that gave Dell a much better picture of what they had inside their environment, right? I do think, though, that there are a lot of organizations, we see this particularly with some of the most highly profitable organizations, right? This is interesting in our data set. I always say that the HR technology vendors oftentimes aren't quite sure what to do with some of the data that I get, because it oftentimes is a little contradictory to the market. The most profitable organizations oftentimes are using the older technologies, right? Okay. But part of that is because they've done exactly what you talked about. They invest a lot of money in integration. They invest a lot of money in making data is flowing. So the older technology can be an organization if you invest in a lot of that kind of integration efforts, right?
Mhm.
But then you end up with some other issues, which is, what is the usability and those type of things, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I think every organization really has to do a little bit of their own self-audit. And I do think, vendors can help you with this. I think big consulting firms can help you. The small consulting firms. The one thing that I do tell people is be very careful about bringing in a big consultant to audit and tell you what to do.
yeah.
That's
That's an open ticket.
it is. It's an open ticket, and they know this. I mean, we all know this. We live in the business world. We're not naive. They all have partnerships. They all have things they're trying to get out of it. And
Yeah.
yes, everybody's trying to do their best, but
Yeah.
you really have to have someone in your organization who understands your culture and understands what you're trying to get out of it. I
Mhm.
mean, I won't name any names, but we know some very large distribution organizations and very large, sales organizations who have tried to go the route of let's bring a bunch of companies in to look at our systems. And the
Yeah.
culture wasn't willing to actually make the changes, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
So then they end up with payroll issues. And we all know
Uh-huh.
that's not where you want to be.
Yeah. That's a whole other issue there, as it relates to someone's money.
Yes. Yeah. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, for executives and CEOs and financial officers, this is not something you can outsource. If you
Mm.
do, you will end up in the newspaper with a payroll issue, which is not
Okay.
what you want to end up with.
Okay.
And when I
Okay.
say a payroll issue, I mean people in your organization not getting paid the way they should.
Uh-huh.
Fines, regulatory audit. If you
Yeah.
think your HR systems are something that um, is secondary to your finance conversation or secondary to your marketing, you're running one of the biggest risks in your organization. Right?
Yeah. Huge compliant risks, as a result of that. So talk to us about the new technology. I mean, the new survey that you did. What are some key points that popped out from that? Major insights.
Yeah, so we've been running this. It's called the annual HR System Survey. We've been running it for over 24 years. It is the longest running HR assessment of the kind of technology plus the people and the processes around the technology that support business outcomes. So we ask, it isn't just what technology are you using. We look at what they're planning to do, and we also look at how that sits inside of the business outcomes they're achieving inside the organization. We do a lot of financial analysis as well as reflection on improvement in the organization for sustainable outcomes. And this year, I think, one of the things we were trying to understand, and I talked to you early on before we got all the data out this year, was what are we in a bit of a blip in the fact that COVID-19 happened? Just we're still in the midst of it in many ways, right? And that impacted all of our data in 2020. It's impacted all of our data in 2021. Is that something we need to throw out? Can we use that data
Oh,
to move
wow. Okay.
forward?
Okay.
Right. And it's interesting. I gave this the key findings at the big annual HR Tech conference here in the US in Las Vegas.
I saw that. Yeah.
And I can't tell you how many people came up to me afterwards and said, thank you for telling us that it's okay to question our data. They said, so we're looking at our engagement scores and we're not sure if we should do anything with them, right?
Yeah.
we're looking at our turnover rates and saying, is this a blip in the world that we're in?
Mm.
And what our data found, and I think we're a little bit ahead because of the way, we look forward with our research as well as backwards. What our data found is that, yes, there were big dips in almost everything in 2020, big changes, swings in the data.
Yeah.
But we saw everything bounce back up in 2021 as far as plans and going forward expectations and adoptions and all the things that we track to a close to where we would have been at in 2019 if COVID-19 hadn't happened, right?
Mm.
So I think I don't think you should sort of assume that everything in your world has changed dramatically. I think you should look at where you were at in 2019 and figure out what's the trajectory you should be on from where that data is at. Secondly, I do think that you should look at the 2020 data and what you came out of 2021 with, if you're still dealing with a lot of differences from the COVID-19, and use that data. And this is what we're doing in our own analysis to think about how you do a better job of your risk assessments and your predictive analytics. How do you build in scenarios and how do you build in that give you a forward look into not all the possible curveballs, but the data you would need if a curveball would be thrown at you, right?
Okay.
Not exactly what they might be or which direction they'll head.
Yeah.
But one of the things we found in 2020 and 2021, people scrambled to get data to make the decisions they needed to make. So if you needed to understand all the skills within your organization and how to redeploy people, and you didn't have that in 2020, that's an area you should be looking at.
Yeah.
Right?
The operative word you used there was scramble. I'm like, oh gosh, if that comes to fruition and we're putting things together, that's just compounding errors on top of that. If we use that to make decisions moving forward.
Because I think the assumption of it's a blip, it's not. We will have more of these, right?
Okay.
You have to be prepared for them. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a show I'd love to watch on TV. It's called Aircraft Investigations. But the reason I like it is because of the theme. And the theme is you design from disaster.
Yes.
So if you look at that COVID period as a major disruption, how are you going to design systems and processes going forward that we have the flexibility that we can move or shift as things, because as you said, it's not going away. This is going to continue to happen.
Yes. Yeah. So you shouldn't change your, and this is the thing I think I get into this frustrating conversation with some of the futurists in our HR field, right? They're like, the world has changed. You need to treat everything different. You need to throw everything out and start over. I think that would be a disservice based on what we're seeing in our data. Yeah. I think you need to reassess a lot of the data you had going into 2019 and make sure that the trajectory, hasn't shifted because you haven't shifted your business model or something, right? But because our data is showing that we're going to come back to where we're at. We're not going to be too far off of it, right? But we are going to have more of these more often. And so what we have, I love your analogy, right? I have seen that show. I will say as a frequent flyer, it can get a little bit.
I know. Yeah. Yeah, because you on a flight and there's turbulence and all that. So, oh my God! Yeah. So here's the end result when it works the bad way. Yeah, I know. So I like to torture myself. That's I work 45 minutes of torture.
Yeah, but it's a good analogy.
But the concept of that, and they say that the reason they do a thorough investigation of each disaster is they're trying to build a better system for the next level of either planes or whatever it is. And if we can keep pointing out these disasters and you build from that.
Yes.
And I think the COVID experience has been perfect as it relates to that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think for executive leaders and for HR leaders as well, the thing that may have to change is the idea that I do this once and I do risk planning and I don't revisit it again until 3 or 4 years later. Yeah. I do think that we are going to have to build into our DNA as businesses some sort of regular risk analysis on an annual basis that we're just revisiting. The world changes too fast for us to make these 2 and 3 year conversations. Right?
Yeah. Well, see, that's the COVID learning experience and you have to learn from that. So one of the things I tend to tell, if you look at finance reports on all the numbers, product lines, all these things, efficiencies, all of these things. Well, in theory, they do.
Yeah.
But when you look at an HR department, do we monitor, and I call it pulsing, each initiative, each process, and we go through that. We do a yearly cleansing, the same as the finance team would do, crunch all the numbers. And when I talk to leaders, they do it because it's an issue with compliance because they have to do it. But the consistently monitoring the performance and efficiencies of the department, it's not done.
No, yeah, it's not done. Nor are we consistently monitoring and assessing the efficiencies of our systems or of our metrics. Are these the metrics we want to keep measuring? Right. I mean, there is a conversation about the fact that sometimes we're just measuring the wrong thing. If we're measuring engagement and we're still having 30% or 112%, if you're in the retail business, right, turnovers, is that and we're taking action based on the engagement surveys, but we're not seeing any impact, then something's wrong there. And so we need to figure out, are we measuring our things right? Yeah.
Which is a different mindset from an HR professional of a consultative background. I mean, this is the kind of issue you possibly could call in a consultant, work with you on that. But if you have the skill set embedded within HR, we can see it's a problem. And this is what someone told me: I don't need you to continually tell me that the numbers are bad. I need a solution to it. So next time you come into the big room, I need a solution. No more giving me trends and all these kinds of things. What are you doing? What is your game plan?
Yeah. And I think that's a skill set we haven't. I mean, every HR professional is different. Every HR leader is different. But I don't know that we've always given them the leeway to think that way, though, right? And I think, to me, that sits at the CEO, the CFO level, that you need to make sure that your HR leaders feel like the big decisions are in their hands, that they're part of helping you run the business. If you aren't looking at your HR function in that way and you expect that kind of conversation, you can't have it both ways. You can't have HR being treated more as a personnel or an administrative function in your organization and then still expect them to come to you with strategic answers, right?
So you mentioned reporting. I know I've been reading articles about the SEC, for public traded companies. They're trying to decide about having a human capital kind of report in their financials. A lot of companies have already moved ahead and done samples of it. Verizon did one that's just absolutely phenomenal. And it's all about understanding the numbers and the data inside of organizations. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that would give us a better understanding of our companies if we had to go through that extensive process every year?
I do. I think it is a step in the right direction, because to me, what gets measured this is just the world that we live in, right? And so government oversight, not just from a sheerly definition perspective, right, will help, because every company will have to understand the standards across the definitions, right? So I think it's a really important step in the right direction. It's going to create a lot of red tape. It's going to create a lot of pain for companies. I get it. I know that, but I think there's we often see this a bit of a, yes, it's a pain, and no, I don't individually want to do it, but a sigh of relief that I don't have to come up with that definition anymore, right?
Okay.
But I do think, but I will say that at least with the human capital metrics work that was done for at least the United States, those definitions are still very watered down. So I think we're gonna, those will over time get better, but they're still very much like your training numbers. Well, that could be any number, right?
1,000 people, smiley faces, and
exactly, right. Like, what does training mean? Those kind of things. So we will get more clarity on this, just like we did in finance. It took a lot of years to get there. But I do think that there's things I think HR or business leaders need to be aware of. One is, if you're getting a lot of your consulting from the big 4 audit partners, right? Like the big 5, I don't know how many there are now, but if they are going to be in the role of auditing your HR metrics, like your finance metrics, they will not be allowed to be a consultant and advising you on your HR processes and approaches. So just be aware of that. So we've seen a little bit of this. Some of those consulting firms have already spun off certain practices because they want to be able to do this audit, right? They're preparing for the audit work on this, at least here in the States, but I think internationally as well. We're seeing a little bit of that because Europe's coming up with some of this stuff as well. And they can't be advising you and auditing you at the same time. Similar, it's the same issue we ran into with the Accentures and the Andersons and all of that back in the day, right? So what that means, sorry. What that means is you have to really think a little bit about, where are you getting your advice from, and how is that ever audit process you are going to have to go through eventually, right? So there's a bit of that conversation every business leader should be thinking about. The other thing I think that they should be really thinking about is, are you talking to your system vendors, and how prepared are they on this side of the conversation? The system vendors should be working directly with every government on the type of metrics and the definition of those metrics. And you should be able to go to your vendor and say, what is your preparation efforts in the human capital metrics model for the United States and for Europe and for the other areas? How are you making sure that what you're giving me in dashboards and data and capturing information is going to prepare me for any of this? And very valid question to ask your vendors, every vendor in the HR space. And similarly to the way you'd ask them about GDPR requirements, right? And then finally, I think in preparation for this, I think we will need to make sure that our heads of HR have a role that is overseeing not just the functional areas of HR, but you do need a more strategic role that's looking at these metrics across the organization.
Yeah.
Because the worst thing that will happen is if each function rolls something up and something gets missed and you did, and it's because you didn't have someone who was looking at the whole process, right?
Yeah. The big picture. One of the things I was reading some of your work, and you mentioned 3 types of organization has emerged from the from your study and research. Can you walk us through those 3 types?
3 types of organizations from the you'll have to give me there's a lot of different places where I define types of organizations. Are you talking about sort of the service delivery model, or are we talking about in terms of sort of
I think it was connected to the findings of the research that you did, and you said 3 type organizations has emerged from that.
Well, this year we came up with a couple of things that we found that was in this sort of 3 types of organizations that came out of what happened with the COVID-19 crisis, right? So what we found in that analysis was that there were organizations who went into the COVID-19 crisis with a strong approach to what I would consider practical talent management, not just the fluffy stuff set across the top, right? But they had spent energy on skills management. They had spent energy defining really strong recruiting processes that could be turned internally and externally. They had really invested heavily in developmental tools that could be deployed rapidly, and they had strong communications with their organizations. We saw other organizations who went into COVID-19 management crisis, and we called those basically those are talent-driven based organizations, right? They were very talent focused. We saw a lot of other organizations who went into the COVID-19 crisis with great technology, emerging technology, right? A lot of investment in that technology, but not a lot of investment in the adoption of that technology or in the process changes that were needed to go along with it. And interesting organization. Then we saw a lot of organizations who went in with, they had gone into the COVID-19 crisis as highly optimized as possible, had not invested a lot in talent management, had not invested a lot in the processes of HR being more than just a compliance-based function, right?
Yeah.
And those organizations that were basically doing continuous talent management, by and far in all of our data set, came out of the COVID-19 crisis, because we did a pre-financial look and then a post-financial look, along with things like growth of employment and per employee revenue numbers and those type of things, and per employee profit numbers. And what we found by and far is that the outcomes were higher for those who had come into COVID with that talent-driven approach to their organization.
Okay.
And I know that sounds a little bit, I always tell people, it's really easy as an HR professional to say, oh, it's great to do talent management. I would say that for the last 5 or 6 years, we've been looking for, we're doing talent management. The ROI has not been there in some cases, right? I think what this COVID-19 crisis showed us is the investment in talent management is not about what you get each year. It's about the flexibility you need during crisis.
So
There's
with that,
a lot of opportunity there.
So would that kind of tie in? So you're talking about talent management interpretation, and if we look inside of the so-called HR community, we have different interpretations of that. So what's the glossary-driven talent management framework look like at this organization? If I'm talking to senior leaders, I said, can you walk me through your talent management framework or your strategic talent management approach? And it may just be centered on just one piece of that, but you have a department that covers a lot of areas. Is it all connected? Is that what we're kind of talking about here? Having that approach that we are covering the entire organization through that lens of talent?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what we saw in our data and what we track every year is, we ask about metrics that are talent related. We ask about metrics that are sort of business related, and we ask about metrics that are HR operations related. Right. And what we have found is that, the talent metrics went down this year across the board without a doubt, because it includes things like how effective am I at keeping my top talent, right? We know the markets, we saw a 13% drop in the percentage of organizations who said that was improving. But what I think the conversation is that, what we learned through COVID, because many organizations who had invested in talent management had not invested in putting that data all in one place, right? They'd done very siloed, like great recruiting, great training and development, great, sort of skills management. And what we saw a lot of HR spending their time on, which I think was part of the reason why when they came out of COVID, we saw that there was a lot of value put on what HR had done, but not HR themselves were not feeling like they had created a lot of value, right? Like HR felt like we hadn't done as good as we wanted to. Yeah. And what our data was showing was that it was because HR had to go back to manual efforts to pull that data together to help the company make a decision. And that was the fact that it had been siloed, right?
Okay. So let's take a break, and then we'll come back. Because I want to ask you, I'll tell you what I wanted to go to when we come back, is the story you told about your father changing careers and the impact that had. So I thought that was so cool. So let's take a break, and we'll come back.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah Tabit. I'm the author of Inclusion Starts With You, a book intended to call for a world of inclusion for all forms of diversity. The book clarifies the term of diversity and inclusion in corporate and beyond, and explains that really the term is about promoting the uniqueness of people and embracing different perspectives, mindsets, and really make sure that everybody can move the needle on the topic of diversity and inclusion. Becoming an international author is all about promoting the message globally and beyond. The experience has been amazing, and really the sky is the limit with what you can do with the book. I could have never done this without Passionpreneur support. They have been amazing in the process, in their support, in being available at any time within the journey of publishing and even beyond. Thank you, Passionpreneur, for being there. I would have never done it without you.
As I said before we went out on commercial break, the story you told about your father and the impact it had on your career when you were 12. Can you walk the audience through that?
Yeah, so definitely. And first, I've gotten a lot of comment about, well, you put personal stories in this technical book, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny as I was writing this book about a year and a half into it, I went to Koga and I said, I don't think I'm the right person for this. I think you have to find another author. And the reason was because it felt very like topic by topic clunky. I wasn't figuring out a way to pull it all together. Yeah. And my publishing advisor kind of looked at me and she goes, no, you're the right person. She goes, I've seen your writing. She goes, you need to put more of you in it. And I said, oh, okay. So for anybody out there who's looking at writing a book, that's a tip that my publishing person, my editor told me. And I realized once I started writing why the HR technology and HR world had an impact on my life, everything just fell into place, right? The book actually got done in like 3 months after that. Yeah. And this first story I wrote was the one about my dad. So my dad is an amazing man. He got out of high school, volunteered for at least our armed services in the U.S. early on, before he was 17 years old. Got out of that, went to college, struggled, paid his way through college, and all his life he wanted to do something that would make an impact on the world. That was his big goal, right?
Wow.
And a lot of it was through education. But he early on got a job working in the oil industry. And it was at an oil refinery plant in a little town where we lived at. And it was a really, hard job. He had chemical engineering background from his days in the service, and the chemical engineering background and his work on sort of microelectronics at that point in time, and microwavable electronics goes way back to the 60s, right? Had put him in a role where he was managing, for most people who don't understand, oil pipelines, right, that come across all the different countries everywhere we go. They all carry different types of oil at any one point in time. Like, it's just one pipeline, and you get gas, and you get natural gas, and you get all the different versions and brands of oil that gets sort of eventually extruded into what we put into our cars or other items in our houses and stuff. But back in the day, in the 70s, when my dad was there, now we have machines that tell the pipeline when natural gas is coming down the pipeline versus the crude oil, right? Back then, you only could tell by the weight of the items coming through the pipeline. So you would literally monitor the weight of that liquid coming through and know when you would have to switch the gear to pump it into a new big tank.
Receptacle, yeah.
Yeah. And my dad was responsible for that, switching and gearing and all of that stuff. He supervised a bunch of men who did it. And they were also responsible for monitoring all of those tanks, right? And he would climb up and 0-degree weather, because we lived in northern US where you get below 32 degrees, and test flows and test vapor levels and make sure the whole thing wasn't going to blow up. It was a place that I loved to go because it was this beautiful place with lights, and my dad had butterscotch on the table as a kid, and I just thought it was this magical land. My dad was miserable. He spent 60 plus hours a week on call during the holidays. Came home smelling of gas. Made good money at the time, right? For the time, but was just wanted to change his life, right? Yes. And as a 12-year-old, I just didn't understand how hard that job was, right? And no children generally do understand how hard those jobs are. And my dad took this leap. He finished up his degree, and he got a job as a vocational teacher at that point in time.
Wow.
Which is a high school teacher. Yeah. Which is, something he was able to take his industry background and his degree and merge it together into something that he enjoyed. And as a vocational teacher in electronics and machine, everyone told him, because he had, I think we dropped our salary by half at that point in time. Everyone told him he was crazy for making that leap, right? You're leaving this good job. He's like, not only am I going to get to do something I'm passionate about, but I can grow a career here that will help my family. And for him, it was all about getting me and my brother into a location where we could stay in one place. He could get us in good schools. He could help us, grow into where we wanted to be. And we were moving all over the place in the other role. And I think that the thing that for me that was most empowering about that and watching him do that, not only to take the leap of faith, he followed what he thought were the skills he could do best in the world. He had always been an educator, had always been someone who was helping people through the discussions and the processes. And he said, look, I know that this is a place that I can make a difference. And he said, I'm willing to figure out how to start at the bottom and work my way back up again. And it basically gave me, I think, the ability throughout my career to not feel like I not only was tied to a job,
I know,
but that I was tied to the difference I wanted to make in the world. So every step I've made has always been about, well, what's this going to do? What's this going to do to help me make a difference or an impact in the world? And I think, whatever your passion is, whether that's, animals, or whether that's, environment, or whether that's something, that is, maybe it is financially, you want to make sure your family is financially sound. That's a passion, because I mean, I come from an environment where that's a struggle for a lot of families. And all of those things that gives you have skills beyond oftentimes what you think you do. And so that was the first time where I found the value of your own personal development and skills was shown to me in a way that was oftentimes we don't see in life. So
and you think of people in a job like that, hate it every day, and they endure it for 40 years. But I've always said there's repercussions from that, because that's back into your family structure. You come home, you're aggravated, you're hating what you're doing, and eventually that's going to seep back inside of your personal life.
Yes. Yeah. And I think this, you know, that's an extreme example, of what we're seeing in this great, if you want to call it the Great Resignation or the Great Opportunity, or who we know, there's
whichever
a lot of terms we're putting, right? Is that I think every professional today is looking at the value they're placing on their time, and they're saying, is your company and is this job enough now for the value I now put on the hour that I have in my life, right?
Exactly.
And that was a question my dad asked 30 years ago.
Very insightful. Very insightful.
Yes, exactly. And I think, it's hard for a lot of companies to understand, why the heck would they quit? Where are they going to go? What opportunities are out there? And, we can help keep our employees inside of our organizations. There is no doubt that you can do a lot of work to improve culture, to improve processes, to improve pay, all things that you've got to think about. But I think we also have to ask ourselves, is this the place that makes the most sense for that professional too? Right?
So you're talking about the so-called Great Resignation. Did you see the news the other day, Better.com, when they laid off 700, 900 people?
Oh, yeah. We were talking about it.
Yeah, online. So I said, this is why people are leaving totally tone deaf and not even giving any concern about a workforce that you're getting ready to implode 3 weeks before Christmas.
3 weeks before Christmas. And you had the audacity to say the first statement about yourself and how you felt. Right? I mean, so we were at a strategy offsite this week, which is why I was traveling. And our team literally put it on speakerphone and played it. And we said, this is why we're doing the research we're doing, team. Just FYI.
Exactly.
But I think, there's a reality check that every executive has to sit down and look in the mirror, and they need to get to know not only their employees, but the work environments. And they need to get to know how the processes and the decisions that they're making are impacting people's lives. And, I have this very, depending on what side of the conservative or liberal side you sit on in any environment, right? Whether sort of you should be looking at trying to make as much money as possible in an organization, whether or not you should be looking at more social good along.
I think we are frozen. Okay, Ade, could you pull it back to, maybe that commercial again or something until Stacey unfreezes? Is that possible? Because the technology has us frozen. Okay, Ade, are you there? Okay, let's begin the process of closing it out. Thank you so much for attending this show. We'll try and get it back. We can get it back in a few minutes or so. This is our last CEO series for the year. We'll be starting up again in mid-January with a strong list of people across the globe to give you further insight from the organization's perspective, from our personal perspective as it relates to careers. We have career experts coming on, and people that have had amazing careers is going to give you insights and have discussions around that. So I thank you all for attending all of our CEO series. I think we're coming close to maybe 100 that we've done so far. You can check us out on our YouTube channel, Strategy Focus Group on YouTube, and all of our past interviews are listed there. So thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see you in January. Thank you. Ade, can we close out? Okay, we're having technical issues.